sort of cap off a wonderful day that we've had today. Again, I want to thank Joelle LeClaire for all the work she's done and putting together the conference. Thank all of you for coming from all over the place. I think this has been a great event, and we really appreciate you coming to Buffalo, land of sun and warm air. Then without further ado, I want to introduce our guest speaker, John Henry, who I've said that if he does need to sit down, we're going to do it over there where he can actually eat dessert. So, okay, John.
Thank you. Do I need this, the microphone?
Yes.
All right, let's see what happens. Is that okay?
Get it in your mouth.
That okay?
That's pretty good.
Okay. Over the last couple of years, Jan Kregel and I have conducted something of a reading program.
Put it closer to your mouth.
I don't like this, actually.
Too bad, we do.
Conducted something. I'm going to start again in another 10 minutes. There'll be a test at the end of this one. I don't like this. Okay.
There you go.
Over the last couple of years, Jan Kregel and I have conducted something of a reading program project surrounding the Great Depression and the Roosevelt New Deal program. And we started this is not a concerted effort. We started this independently and discovered that we were doing roughly the same amount of reading. And so we started to exchange information and what have you. And one of the works that I read was a relatively new work, 2014, by Crawford Goodwin, who is a major historian of economic thought and headed up the program at Duke University. And he published this book on Walter Lippmann, public economist.
Interesting.
Now, the older people in the crowd, and if the younger people will pay attention here because there will be a test. The older people in the crowd know who Walter Lippmann was. Probably the most important public intellectual in the United States of the 20s, 30s, into the post-World War II period. And I think the only possible contestant for that honor would have been John Dewey. But Walter Lippmann had a regular column in the New York Herald Tribune. And at that time, in the 1920s,
No, thank you. Actually, would you give it to
Tribune
on that table over there? Just give it to those kids. I'm not going to eat it. Would you just put it over there right now? I'll eat it.
And as a consequence, Lippmann was conversing with major academics, major politicians, scientists, the whole gamut of the movers and shakers of U.S. society in particular. Hence, he was an intelligent critic of U.S. society who moved in the right circles. Now, his political orientation changed markedly over the years. If you look at Walter Lippmann in the 1910s, he would have been a moderate socialist. By the 1930s, he was a staunch liberal. Liberal in the old sense of the word, classical liberalism, John Locke, property rights, laissez-faire, individualism, right? Not the newfangled form of liberalism. And in 1936, he published a book entitled The Good Society. And I'm pretty sure I read this in college when I took a course in political science, but I can't provide evidence of that. Now, what's the significance of the Good Society? The Good Society was the book that prompted the first conference in Paris to promote what has become called neoliberalism. In 1938, Raymond Aron, Friedrich Hayek, Ludwig von Mises, Michael Polanyi, yes, brother of Karl Polanyi for you heterodox people, Jacques Rueff, William Röpke, etc., met to rescue liberalism, classical liberalism, from its then moribund state. And the name of this colloquium was the La Colloque Walter Lippmann. The Good Society was the basis for the discussion of the first organized meeting that led to what is termed neoliberalism. Now, I don't know if anybody's read that book or anybody's paid attention to the preface. In the preface to the Good Society, Lippmann thanks, among others, Hayek, von Mises, and Keynes, quote, who has done so much to demonstrate to the free peoples that the modern economy can be regulated without dictatorship. This should give pause. Hayek, Mises, Keynes, the same sentence. Lippmann and Keynes were buddies. Their friendship went back to Versailles at the end of World War I, where they first met, and they remained very close, intimate, and I don't mean that in a sexual way. Close, intimate friends until Keynes's death, right, in 44. Right? Whenever Keynes visited the United States in the Washington or New York area, he stayed with Walter Lippmann. So, very close associates. Now, Lippmann, if you read The Good Society and other works of Lippmann in the 1930s, what you find is that Lippmann's brand of liberalism was not the 19th century Manchester form of liberalism. It wasn't the laissez-faire, perfectly individualist form of liberalism that was the common form of liberalism that was then promoted. Lippmann saw a significant role for government, an activist government, reduce income inequality, a steeply graduated income tax, heavily weighted toward unearned income, limitations on corporate power, etc. Lippmann recognized, as did Veblen, as did Keynes, as did other astute intellectuals of the period, that the capitalism of the 20th century was not the capitalism of the 19th century. In Veblen's terms, there was a new order, and it was the order of oligopolized capitalism, right? What Baran and Sweezy and others call monopoly capital. And also Lenin, of course, called monopoly capital. Basically, you now had a capitalist order where you had collectivized labor in the form of unions. You had collectivized corporate power in the form of the various cartels, holding companies, trusts, what have you, an increased role for government that started actually in the 1870s, most prominently in Germany with Bismarck. Lippmann recognized this. Other liberals did not recognize it. They just thought things were bad because it wasn't the 19th century anymore. Quote, "If individuals are to continue to decide when they will buy and sell, spend and save, borrow and lend, expand and contract their businesses, some kind of compensatory mechanism," this is the important term, "to redress their liability to error must be set up by public authority. It has become necessary to create collective power, to mobilize resources, and to work out technical procedures by means of which the modern state can balance, equalize, neutralize, offset, and correct private judgments of the masses of individuals. This is what I mean by a compensated economy and the method of free collectivism." That's Walter Lippmann, right? He's saying, look, it's a new world out there, right? You don't have competition anymore. Everything is regulated, but it's regulated by corporations, it's regulated by unions, it's regulated by et cetera, right? What we need, and he calls for this, is a new liberalism, a rejuvenated liberalism that accommodates the new order, the new structure of the capitalist economy, okay? Now, as I said, Keynes and Lippmann were buddies. And when the general theory appeared, Lippmann was ecstatic. And he ran around New York and Washington holding up the book and said, "Man, you gotta read this. This is the greatest thing since sliced bread." I'm looking for my quote here. And in a 1937 column in the Herald Tribune, wrote, "The man who has done more than any other living person to develop a scientific basis for this policy, the New Deal, and to popularize it is Mr. John Maynard Keynes. Few economists have ever exerted as wide an influence on practical affairs in their own time." Okay? Now, why would a noted liberal and one who is calling for a new liberalism extol the virtues of a guy who is generally associated with some form of collectivism and is often labeled a socialist? And in fact, if you go into the literature of the 1950s, what you'll find is that there are writers who claim that Keynes was responsible for everything from the atomic bomb to rock and roll. A really bad guy, right? All of this work coming from Lippmann, coming from the study of the 1930s, etc., raises a fundamental question about Keynes, right? Now, if you're a Keynesian, post-Keynesian, or whatever you want to call yourself, you say, okay, Keynes stands in opposition to neoliberalism, okay? I'm going to argue that Keynes was a neoliberal. There's a punchline at the end. I caution you. There is a punchline, but let's go through an argument. When we think of neoliberalism in the United States, I know this is cross-border, so there's a couple of Canadians in the crowd, right? But when we think of neoliberalism in the US, we tend to associate it with the new Chicago, Milton Friedman, Stigler, etc. And of course, you know, Friedman's Capitalism and Friedman is still on the bestseller list, right? I don't know how many hundreds of thousands or millions of copies that thing has gone through, But that's the tendency. There's the foundation for neoliberalism, right? We'll come back to that down the road, okay? Let's start with the story. 1929, the British government establishes a committee to investigate the causes of the Great Depression and possible solutions. And this is early, 1929, right? The thing really hasn't gotten underway yet. And they appoint a committee of major economists under the chairmanship of John Maynard Keynes. And included in that committee were notables such as Hubert Henderson, Dennis Robertson, Pigou, Josiah Stamp, and Lionel Robbins. Okay. Remember that name. Now, Robbins was a very young economist, very active, very dynamic, good-looking, right, had a lot of appeal, and he was associated with the London School of Economics. Now, in the meetings of that committee, Keynes made some very modest proposals. And Bob Diamond isn't here tonight. I don't know how many of you heard Bob Diamond's paper this morning, but in the late 20s, early 30s, Keynes was still somewhat optimistic about the ability of governments to contain the Depression. In 1929, Keynes makes two proposals. He says, well, let's try some public works. Now that comes out of two essays that he wrote prior to the period, one with Hubert Henderson, Can Lloyd George do it, right? And where he recommended public works. The other thing that he recommended was a 10% bounty on exports and a 10% tariff on imports, violating the free trade dogma of classical liberalism. Both of these proposals are anti-laissez-faire. It was a very moderate public works proposal, right? But the violation of free trade really irritated Robbins. Now, Robbins was young, right? He hadn't yet made his mark. And when he went back to his academic position, he went to the chair of the department at the London School of Economics, Cannon, and said, look, we got to do something. There's this lunatic out there who's got a pretty big reputation, and he's making proposals that are anti-liberal, anti-free trade, anti-Manchester, right? We have to stop him. I'm not making this up. One of the ways we can do this is to bring this guy from Austria, who's a very strong liberal, to the LSE, and make him Took Professor of Economics, one Friedrich von Hayek, right? As a consequence of developments in the early 1930s at the LSE became the leading center of liberalism and then eventually neoliberalism in Europe. And for you young folks who think that the LSE is a socialist cabal, right? If you look at the history of the LSE, even though it was started by Fabians, right? For most of its existence, it's been a very conservative, liberal, again in the classical sense, stronghold, right? Now, okay, well, see if I can find out where the heck I am here. Look at the people who came out of the LSE in the 1930s, and I'll mention most of these names you younger people have never heard of, okay? But there's one that stands out, and I'll save that for the end. Arthur Selden, Basil Yamey, William Hunt, Frank Page, Peter Bauer. Okay, now, most of the younger people have never heard those names. They were very prominent in the post-World War II period. The name you have heard is Ronald Coase. All of those people were associated with the first neoliberal umbrella think tank, the Institute of Economic Affairs, founded in 1955 by a former chicken farmer. Heinrich Himmler was a chicken farmer too. For those of you who remember Germany, you've heard of, the Nazis and all that sort of stuff. All of them were associated with Mont Pelerin. All of them were early neoliberals. If you have any illusions about Ronald Coase and you think that what he has done, transaction cost analysis, etc., is progressive and what have you, and anti-neoclassical, guess again. Right? Read the stuff carefully. Over in Geneva, the Graduate Institute of International Studies is actually a French name, but I would butcher it and I don't want to embarrass myself too badly, had sponsored conferences in 1935, 1937, focusing on the consequences of Keynesianism. In the 1930s, Keynes was the arch enemy of those who eventually became the leading neoliberals. At the Institute, which was the Geneva Institute, which was funded by the Rockefeller Foundation, which also was throwing money at the LSE, were Jacob Viner. For those of you, again, who know anything about Jacob Viner, who I kind of like, actually, and Ludwig von Mises, who I detest. I like Viner mainly, not for his trade stuff, and Jan Kregel can speak to that, or Randy can speak to that, but for his stuff in History of Economic Theory, where he talks about the role of religion in economic theorizing. All right. As a consequence of these early developments, eventually a call was put out for a meeting in Paris. This was the colloque Walter Lippmann, right? The French philosopher Louis Rogier set out an appeal to leading liberals to meet in Paris to decide what to do about the problem of the demise of classical liberalism, the resuscitation of liberalism, and this SOB by the name of John Maynard Keynes. In that meeting, extremely powerful people in the post-World War II period convened. And if you look at the United States contingent, you'll see individuals such as Frank Knight and others, right? Now, the point is, so far, that if I'm claiming that Keynes was a neoliberal, how is it that the early neoliberals were anti-Keynesian and adamantly anti-Keynesian? Well, let's go to Keynes himself. Keynes, the neoliberal. Now, everybody here has read the essays in the collection, including, of course, Am I a Liberal and The End of Laissez-Faire, and well, can Lord George do it? Can, all those essays in Essays in Persuasion. You've all read those essays. I have read those essays. And when I initially read those essays, I read them as leading up to the general theory, right? And in The End of Laissez-Faire, that's a watershed article. That's where Keynes says, the heck with the old stuff, we got to develop something new, right? I want you to read them again, and I want you to read them from the other end, right? Post general theory. Go back and say, what was Keynes really up to, right? Well, if you go to the two essays I mentioned, The End of Laissez-Faire and Am I a Liberal, written in the mid-1920s, what you can in fact see is Keynes as a dissatisfied classical liberal, because the world has moved beyond classical liberalism, and someone struggling to discover a new liberalism. From Am I a Liberal? Here is the problem. If we don't come up with a theoretical and practical program to salvage capitalism, capitalism will be, in fact, replaced by what he calls communism. That's the world in which we live. So we need a way to save capitalism, and we aren't going to save it by falling back on the old liberal doctrines of the 18th and 19th century. In Am I a Liberal, he quotes extensively from John R. Cummins, okay, who divided the world, the capitalist world, into three stages, and we were in the stage of stabilization. Here is the problem. Quoting from Cummins, stabilization, the new order in Veblen's terms, oligopoly capital, our stage, is the actual alternative to Marx's communism. In this period, there is a diminution of, this is Commons, there is a diminution of individual liberty enforced in part by government sanctions, but mainly by economic sanctions through concerted action, whether secret, semi-open, open, or arbitrational, of associations, corporations, unions, and other collective movements of manufacturers, merchants, laborers, farmers, and bankers. It's a world of collective organizations. It's not an individualized world, right? Which never did exist. But if you look at the world of Adam Smith, it was closer to that ideal than the world of Keynes, Commons, Hayek, Robbins, and the like. Further, and again, this is Commons, the transition from economic anarchy to a regime which deliberately aims at controlling and directing economic forces in the interest of social justice, I'm sorry, this is Keynes, it's not Commons, in the interest of social justice and social stability, will present enormous difficulties, both technical and political. I suggest, nevertheless, that the true destiny of new liberalism is to seek their solution. He's calling for a new liberalism, right? So, if you look at these essays, he's saying, look, we're not in the world of our grandfathers. We have to figure out the way to accommodate the individual in the context of collective activity. Not just collective activity on the part of government, but collective activity on the part of unions, corporations, etc., the whole gamut. Okay? That's a different world. And so how do we do that? We want to reserve as much individual freedom as possible We want markets, however those are defined, to be as vibrant as possible. But if we simply let the economy to its natural forces, we aren't going to have capitalism any longer. So, stabilization, a policy directed towards stabilization, is the necessary antidote and alternative to socialism. The end of laissez-faire, 1926, was actually a lecture delivered in Germany in 1924 and then published in 1926. You've all read this, okay? So he says a lot of stuff. And the first thing he says is, look, all this liberal stuff was never a positive program. It was a negative program directed against the feudal church and the feudal state. We want freedom from the control of the church, from the state. Right? That's the first point. And then he goes on and he gives a brief history of liberalism. That isn't actually too bad. If you're a good historian of economic thought or political thought, you can point fingers and say, you're wrong about this, wrong. It's actually not a bad summary, okay? And then he starts his criticism. And the first criticism is the individualistic capitalist concern, the love of money. And this is a moral defect of capitalism. A system which allows the skillful or fortunate individual to reap the whole fruits of this conjuncture evidently offers an immense incentive to the practice of the art of being in the right place at the right time. Thus, one of the most powerful of human motives, namely the love of money, is harnessed to the task of distributing economic resources in the way best calculated to increase wealth. But that way is not the best way to organize society. And then he goes on to discuss economic theorizing. And he says, look, one of the criticisms of neoclassical theory of the day, Marshallian and Walrasian, mainly Marshallian, is that they don't talk about the basic problem. There's going to be a test. They don't talk about the basic problems that the world faces. And he says, that's not true. That's not true. For the first 13 weeks of a class, you are treated to the perfectly competitive, equilibrium-seeking model of neoclassical theory, fundamental theory. The last 2 weeks, you bring into the discussion what we now call market imperfections. So you're talking about the real world. But that's the last 2 weeks, the last 2 chapters of the... It's disturbing if you're in this end, okay? Anyway, the last 2 weeks, the last 2 chapters of the text. And then he goes on and says, okay, you have this simplified hypothesis that leads to these really nice neoclassical conclusions. And then you have the real world. However, the student comes out with the position that they regard the simplified hypothesis as health and the further complications as disease. The real world, the neoclassical equilibrium model is the ideal, and reality is the departure from the ideal. The best economist I know of who speaks to this is Frank Knight, actually, University of Chicago, the old Chicago. And a number of people have been confused about Knight, thinking that he's like Jeff Hodgkins, an institutionalist. The most intelligent neoclassical economist of the 20th century, in my opinion. I would urge you to read him, because he picks up on Keynes's point, and he tells you what the ideal is, and then why the reality is of a secondary nature to the ideal. Keynes goes on, right? We must aim at separating those services which are technically social from those which are technically individual. The most important agenda of the state relate not to those activities which private individuals are already fulfilling, but to those functions which fall outside the sphere of the individual, to those decisions which are made by no one if the state does not make them. What he's calling for is what he later termed the state or the government as the entrepreneur-in-chief. You're familiar with that expression, the entrepreneur-in-chief, right? You have this government, the bureaucracies, the semi-medieval corporations, right, who are set up, in fact, to oversee the economy, right? Minsky talks about the E4s of capitalism, the banking system, and they aren't fulfilling their responsibility. You need overseers, you need directors, you need guidance, right? And that is the role for these government bureaucracies. And then he goes on and he talks about the evils of modern capitalism. And there are two fundamental evils. This is 1926. Unemployment and income inequality. Now, what are the two evils that you find in the general theory? Unemployment and income inequality, right? And so he says, okay, we got to deal with this stuff. We got to deal with this stuff. Because if we don't deal with this stuff, capitalism is kaput. Now, you go through the general theory in various sections of the general theory, you go through his earlier works and you say, okay, if you look at it from a particular vantage point, what he's calling for is a new liberalism. That is neoliberalism, right? He's in accord with those guys who are meeting in, and they were guys, who are meeting in Paris, and they're laying out an agenda for forthcoming future developments, right? What they want to do. And they've been pretty doggone successful, right? Now, more specifically, you can develop relationships with card-carrying neoliberals. People like Hayek, people like Michael Polanyi, right? Start with his relationship to Hayek. Everybody here is familiar with the famous letter that he wrote after the publication of The Road to Serfdom. And Kate says, I'm in agreement with much of it, morally and philosophically. So, but you got a problem, right? You're against planning, except that in your book itself, you call for a modicum of planning. You're on the slippery slope, right? That you condemn because it leads to tyranny, dictatorship, etc. Where do we stand with regard to planning? Keynes said, I'm sure that I welcome much more planning than you, but we all welcome planning. And then, and I think this is the important consideration, what we need, what we really need, is a restoration of right moral thinking, a return to proper moral values in our social philosophy. Right? If only you could turn your crusade in that direction. Is that? If only you could turn your crusade.
Time's up.
If only you could turn your crusade in that direction, you would not feel quite so much like Don Quixote. Now, of course, Hayek did not end up as Don Quixote. Hayek ended up as quite powerful in terms of the developments of the 70s, 80s into the present period. Now, a standard interpretation of that letter is Keynes is being politicked. You know, during World War II, LSE people came to Cambridge. Keynes hosted Hayek. They had a personal association, more or less. And Keynes is just being politicked. I don't think so. I think they actually have a fundamental agreement, and it's the issue not of the economic theorizing, but the moral issue, or ethical issue, or whatever you want to call it. Go back to Keynes's essay 1923 on his visit to Russia. Now, 1923 is way too early to judge any new economic system, and that's, of course, what the Soviets were attempting to build. But nevertheless, he made his observations, and he didn't care for it. Didn't like it, and it's inefficient. But he noticed something. The exaltation of the common man is a dogma which has caught the multitude before now. Any religion, and he claims it's a religion not of a formal nature, any religion and the bond which unites co-religionists have power against the egotistic atomism of the irreligious. And that's capitalism, and the individualism, and the love of money. If irreligious capitalism is ultimately to defeat religious communism, it is not enough that it should be economically more efficient. It must be many times as efficient. And he calls for a new religion to replace former religion that was dominant in the 19th century. Read Robert Skidelsky, right? England was maintained by evangelical Christianity coupled with social deference. That's the 19th century, okay? And he calls for a new religion, a new ideology, something to accommodate the new economic order, right? Go to Hayek, his last book. Now, I'm quite aware that the last book, The Fatal Conceit, was partially written by the editor, right? That there's a question as to how much is Hayek and how much is the editor. I'm quite aware of that. I don't care, because there's a section in The Fatal Conceit that is consistent with Hayek. So whether he actually wrote it or whether it was just the editor's taking of Hayek's ideas is irrelevant. Here's the problem. We started out as communists. This is Hayek. We started as communists and we had a bond. We had social cohesion. And along comes the extended order, which results in capitalism, the separation of people, the individualism. So we have lost our early bonds. We're sort of floating in a morass of individualism. It is partly to mystical and religious beliefs that beneficial traditions have been preserved and transmitted at least long enough to enable those groups following them to grow. As an order of human interaction becomes more extended, more individualized, and still more threatening to instinctual claims, our early egalitarian kinship relationships, it might for a time become quite dependent on the continuing influence of such religious beliefs. Hayek is calling for a restoration of formal religion. He's not religious, he's an atheist, so is Keynes. Calling for the restoration of some formal religion, right? As a way to counter the individualism and maintain something of a semblance of a social order. Keynes is calling for religion in a more general sense, an ideology to accomplish the same ends. Keynes and Michael Polanyi. Now, you probably don't know who Michael Polanyi was. Famous chemist, very prominent in the 1930s, 1940s, into the 50s, moved out of chemistry proper into philosophy, just the way sort of Hayek moved out of economics into philosophy. He was an ardent liberal, member of the La Cologne, Walter Lippmann, charter member of Mont Pelerin. But all of these guys that I mentioned were associated with Mont Pelerin, except for Keynes. Okay, and I don't think if Keynes had lived in 1949, I'm pretty sure he would not have been a member. So you have a certified card-carrying liberal, right, who's supposed to be anti-Keynes. Go to his 1945 free trade and full employment. Polanyi writes this economic tree. I don't recommend that you. I tried it, actually. I tried to figure out what exactly he was getting at. Don't do it. Take my word for it. He's trying to merge Keynes with an early primitive form of what came to be called monetarism before Friedman. Right? Polanyi considered, according to his students, considered himself a Keynesian, except that Keynes had to be modified by what we would now call a monetarist program. Now, you can understand why the book is a jumble, right? And why it's impossible to figure. You can't merge the two. You can't merge the two, right? So I'm not suggesting that the book has anything to offer, but just that you have noted neoliberals who are very sympathetic to Keynes. Okay? Next point, and I'm closing in on it. Keynes and the French indicative planning program. Now, interestingly enough, institutionalists love indicative program. When I was working in Sacramento, I was working with a big name institutionalist, Mark Toole. He loved indicative planning. Indicative planning was a neoliberal program. Right? When you hear the word planning and neoliberalism, you know, worlds apart. Nonsense. This was a neoliberal program. In the General Theory, Chapter 24, among other things, Keynes calls for the socialization of investment. Now, it's not clear what he meant by that, because he doesn't go on with a fuller explanation. Jan has written specifically to this, and I ran my notes by him, and he said, I think maybe you're right. French planning was developed as a neoliberal response to or substitute for Soviet planning. And it has nothing to do with Soviet-style centralized planning. Let me quote Charles de Gaulle. At my level, this is the plan because it embraces the whole, sets the objectives, establishes a hierarchy of emergencies and importance, introduces a sense of what is global, orderly, and continuous among those responsible, and even in the public mind compensates for the inconveniences of freedom without losing the advantages. The inconveniences of freedom, by which he means individual freedom, that's the liberal standard, right? So what indicative planning was attempted to do was to set overall objective. This is what we want. This is in the larger public interest, ostensibly, right? And we're going to go about this through a great deal of government activity, government direction, but not government ownership, except in some limited cases, right? We still have private ownership. True, the 4 largest banks were nationalized. The Bank of France was nationalized. The government had minority shares in private sector businesses, right? Infrastructure, post office was public, etc. Transportation was public. Well, that's not a big deal, right? The idea was to serve as the chief entrepreneur in Keynes's terms. You provide direction, stability, organization, structure, so that you produce the results that are anticipated. Now, Keynes would have had specific objections to indicative planning, right? He said, well, nationalization of banks, I'm not so sure about that, right? Kind of thing. But on the whole, if you read Keynes's arguments surrounding the need for government activity in the post-World War II economy, read his stuff on, that he wrote during World War II, it looks like the Keynesian socialization of investment program. In particular, the nationalization of credit to reduce uncertainty, right? And that was a very big aspect of Keynes's agenda. And then I'm not going to deal with this, but take my word for it that if you go to the German ordoliberalism or the social market, you're going to see a heck of a lot of Keynes. And the Ordo liberals came out of Freiburg University in the 1930s, and that's, if you recall, where Hayek ended his academic life as well as his life at Freiburg University. And there's a very interesting relationship between Freiburg and the fascist regime, but let's forget that. The point is that you can find a number of interconnections between Keynes's argument and card-carrying neoliberals, right? If you go beyond the Milton Friedmans of the world, if you confine yourself to Milton Friedmans of the world, no, then you aren't going to find those connections. But here's the punchline. There is no such thing as neoliberalism. There are neoliberalisms, plural. And neoliberalisms run the gamut from purely laissez-faire to planning, from individualized production to collectivized production. anything stopping short of a socialist order. Because that is the main purpose of neoliberalism, to preserve capitalism and to prevent any alternative to capitalism. So if you go through the neoliberals, what you'll see is an attempt, successful so far, to preserve property relations, to move the population away from any socialist ideology or thinking perspective, and basically to make the world safe for capitalist order, including the theoretical and policy recommendations. Minsky, 57 varieties of capitalism. There are 57 varieties of neoliberalism. And Keynes overlaps with, intersects with, interconnects with various neoliberal forms. Was Keynes a neoliberal? Damn right. 57 varieties, okay? If you restrict yourself to a capitalist order, what variety of neoliberalism would you druther prefer? I don't know what your druthers are, but my druther is that I prefer a real Keynesian regime. Thank you. I quit.
So thank you so much, John Henry, for this awesome talk, which is like causing us to reconsider our position on the political spectrum. Political economic,
Yes,
yeah.
You're a
A
neoliberal.
little too deep, I think. So does anybody have any questions that you wanted to pose or something? I think, yeah, we're going to be in there. Okay, let's go. Nathan, you want to start?
Sure, I'll take the first shot. That was excellent talk. I feel very sympathetic to a lot of that, but I guess I wanted to push back a little bit on the last point, that yes, there are many different varieties of neoliberalism, but isn't the essence, the unifying theme, that it's a thought collective around basically repeating the Morawski point. So isn't the fact that he wasn't interested in participating in that thought collective, and you said in your talk that you don't think he would be in the Mont Pelerin Society even if he had been alive for it, does that not suggest that while he was very influential on them, that he wasn't committed to their projects specifically?
Yeah, I mean, you can only answer the question hypothetically, because he dies in 1944, right? 46. He dies in 46. And Mont Pelerin is organized in 49. Now, you already have the movements toward Mont Pelerin. I have looked actually, and found no evidence that he actually had direct connections with these guys who eventually formed Mont Pelerin, what have you. But if you look at his work independently of the card-carrying neoliberalism, you can, that's what I was doing, making a case for Keynes as a neoliberal, right? If he had lived, would he have joined Mont Pelerin? I think not. But you'd be surprised as to the individuals who did participate in early Mont Pelerin and what their arguments were. I've talked to people who are neoliberals and who know the history of the Mont Pelerin Society quite well, right? And there's some of this information is public knowledge. Mises, for example, walks out of the first meeting saying, "You're all socialists," right? Because these guys are saying, well, we need social insurance, we need unemployment insurance, we need this, we need that, we need that. unemployment insurance, you're messing around with the so-called labor market, right? You aren't going to have freely adjusting supply-demand relationships in the labor market. So he says, in his type of neoliberalism, right, dismisses people like Hayek, for goodness sake. And then to the left of Hayek, I mean, we're talking about left relatively speaking here, right? To the left of Hayek, you have others. Frank Knight was to the left. Frank Knight was very suspicious. He participated in Mont Pelerin initially, but he was very uneasy and eventually left, right? But you read Frank Knight and you say, yeah, you're a neoliberal, but not that variety. So, yeah, I don't think Keynes would do it. I really don't.
Thank you, John, for a wonderful presentation. Great. But I think you are, I don't know, I think you're trapped in a vocabulary there to some extent. That might be different than the one that I would use to describe neoliberalism. In fact, Carrie and I wrote a paper commenting on Murawski's work, and I'll give you a good example. Keynes, to me, is in the same kind of traditions of even William Beveridge kind of liberalism. Now, that liberalism is very different from the Hayekian and Mises and so on. Now, it's true you can put them all as neoliberal, but I wouldn't use that terminology at that point, personally.
That's my point.
No, but you refer to it as if they are part of that, and I would say, no, I mean, what the liberalism that we see in Keynes or Beveridge or whatever at the time, is a reaction to the socialist movements developing that were attacking the old liberalism of the 19th century, okay? And therefore, what's happening here is it's a response to something. This is the kind of Karl Polanyi double movement effect here happening, as we argued at the time. And what you see now is people like Hayek and so on in the Mont Pelerin Society redefining, realigning themselves in opposition to this double movement reaction to socialism, which is what Keynes and Beveridge and so on were all about. This is the difference, I think. They want to establish through the state, in this case, the use of the state now apparatus to impose market mechanisms that are closer to the 19th century almost versions here, which is almost, to me, is a contradiction in terms, but that's exactly why they could align themselves with the Pinochet of the world and everything else here. So that's what I'm saying is you're using a terminology here that I feel very uncomfortable to say that they're part of the same, gang here or whatever. But I appreciate what you wrote.
No, I'm not unsympathetic to them, Harry, except that when you look, I'm not unsympathetic to them. And I think I responded actually to the paper you wrote, Harry. I said, yeah, this is fine, except that when you look at certain versions of neoliberalism that are now outmoded, I mean, when was the last time you heard about indicative planning, right? But, capitalism and freedom is still the bestsellers list, right? So when you look at indicative planning,
Jacques Webb was against indicative planning.
Who?
Jacques Webb.
No. I mean, but that's the point, right? That you have all of these controversies, debates, discussions, whatever, as to how to bring about this new program. Or, well, it's not a new program, this revised program, let's put it like that, right? And so when you look at Keynes, you say, well, that's what he was attempting to do. Exactly, right? I mean, we're in agreement there. Now, whether you want to call it neoliberal or not, I don't really care, to tell the truth. I mean, it was to provoke, right? It was designed to provoke. almost like socialism now, because it's so used in so many different ways that it doesn't mean anything. Yeah, so I don't disagree.
I think there was someone else. Is there somebody else that wanted to maybe pose a question?
No, but my question
Yes.
is very similar to that. I mean, it's kind of like, okay, I mean, let's get really concrete. Are you saying that, like, the Democrats that are the same as Trump? I mean, are the neoliberals behind? Is everybody a neoliberal now? I mean, almost. I was in East Germany 30, 40 years ago. I asked a woman, why is this communist? And she said, because the state owns the means of production. Well, isn't that neoliberalism? I mean, where does the word, if you want to use that word, it goes almost without meaning.
That's my point. That we should eliminate it from the vocabulary because it is. That's my point. That we should eliminate it from the vocabulary because it is so all-encompassing at the same time as vacuous. It doesn't mean anything per se. You have to investigate the particular theoretical arguments and policies that these various individuals and organizations have promoted. What we do know is that there are organizations that are promoting a particular policy position that is inimical to the interests of the majority of the world population. That's what we do know. They're organized and we aren't. And we sit around and flap our gums like this. I'm not sure. But yeah, so I think you're right.
Okay, are there any other comments?
Oh, one more point. Indicative planning was also introduced in Spain under the Franco regime, which means that it's not a program unto itself with a particular political orientation, as long as it accomplishes its objectives. Because Franco obviously was not a Democrat. Sorry. Take it away.
Is there anyone else that wanted to pose a question to our lovely speaker? He's quit, so we really have to say thank you. Okay, I think we're going to open the bar again if you want to stay and eat.
Who's going to buy me a scotch? Somebody has to buy me a
You're
scotch.
welcome, but otherwise we resume our session tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock. And the same places where we had the booth today, okay? So in the department area, C209 or B209.